All right, well, let's put the finishing touches on the first set of notes under the topic of perception and action. We've already got through talking about control theory, and we talked about feedback versus feed-forward control. We talked about the kind of information that is required of feed forward control systems. And one of those was about being able to perceive exactly where our hands are in relation to some other object so that we can correctly use that information to plan a movement trajectory from where the hand currently is to where we desire it to be, namely where some other object is that we're reaching to pick up. And we got through under talking about how we know where our hands or bodies are and what they're doing, the efference copy topic and problems associated with that. And that led us to question the feasibility of efference copy, or otherwise known now as certain internal models of predicting the effect of a motor command on the body. And so we're questioning whether that can work out entirely very well. So we have the alternative, which is actual perception of the body from receptors. And I want to wrap up this topic, and it's fairly quick. And in fact, there's quite a bit of detail already in the textbook. And I'm not trying to replicate what's in the book on touch. So I've kind of pared this down to a few things that I think are worth talking about that I want to expand on a little bit. And this shouldn't take too terribly long. So as I have already defined it in a previous video, haptics is how we use our sense of body information to perceive properties of objects that we come into contact with. And this would involve proprioception in perceiving body posture. I especially focused on that when talking about something like grasping an object, and you can feel the shape of the object through your grasp, but that would require proprioception about the shape of your fingers as they wrap around the object. So you have to perceive the shape of your grip in order to perceive the shape of the object, or at least that plays an important role. And the same goes for kinesthesis, perceiving our body's movement. Of course, I can perceive my body move as I just wave my arms around, but it's also very common that when holding an object, we move our hands over it so that we feel movement of the limb segment as we explore an object. Of course, we also feel the movement of the surface of the object across the skin, which is the sense of touch. And we can call that active touch, right? And this is to be contrasted with a lot of more classical studies on touch perception that we might, as I've labeled on the bottom, passive touch research. And passive touch research has played an important role in our understanding of how the touch receptors in the skin work, so that we understand differences in how some receptors have a very small receptive field and others have a large receptive field. And this helps us understand some things about differences in tactile acuity and tactile sensitivity across the skin surface. And even, of course, of how different parts of the somatosensory area of the brain are organized in the parietal lobe of the brain. But while that is, of course, useful, it doesn't necessarily teach us much about how we use our sense of touch to recognize properties of objects. And that's where we need to talk about active touch and haptics. So that's why I'm kind of focusing on that particular topic here. And so using all of that information from the body to perceive objects, here's a mouthful, proprioceptive-exteroceptive linkage, right? So that's what we can call that. And what that boils down to is kind of what I was just saying about perceiving the shape of your grip when holding an object, so that you can use that information to perceive the shape of the object. But it goes beyond that, right? It goes into all of this other stuff of how we haptically explore an object by touching it. And when you hold an object in your hand, you can feel many different properties, right? You can feel its shape, its size. You can feel its material composition, right? You can tell when an object is made out of plastic or metal or wood or whatever it might be, right? So we have this ability. And you can feel its texture, and maybe that plays an important role in the recognizing what it's made out of. You can feel its mass or weight, right? So there's all these different properties of the objects that require haptics, right? It's not just what's happening at the skin surface, it's also happening in the muscles and the tendons and the joints. So we want to understand how proprioception and kinesthesis work a little bit. And in a previous video, I had jumped way ahead and previewed this particular slide, I think. So just to cover our basis here, the main, what we call proprioceptors, that is the actual sensory organs that detect movement and position of the body itself. Some are found in the skin. These are called Ruffini endings or Ruffini cylinders. They're stretch receptors in the skin. So if you think about it, when you make a fist, the skin on the back of your hand will stretch, right? And then when you open your fingers up, it will spring back to its original length. And the same goes for the skin on the back of your elbow, on your knees, shoulders, right? Wherever you have moving parts, your skin has to have some flexibility around those moving parts. And so it's going to stretch a lot. And the Ruffini endings in the skin around those parts of the body can detect that skin stretch and then obviously provide information to the brain about skin stretching, which is relevant to the orientation of the joint and the movement of the joint. But of course, as we've already described with the biomechanics stuff, there are receptors embedded in the muscles, right? And so the muscle has to change length and stretch when we move around. And so these stretch receptors in the muscles are called muscle spindles. And these will obviously change their length when the muscle changes length, and their firing rate is proportional to their length. The same roughly applies to these organs that are embedded in the tendons. The tendons are the points where muscles attach themselves to bone. And embedded within tendons are these fibers called the Golgi tendon organ. And when there is tension on the tendon, which occurs when our muscles stretch and pull on that tendon, that activates the Golgi tendon organ, and it has a firing rate that's, again, somewhat proportional to the tension within the tendon. And there are also what we might call mechanoreceptors, that is, receptors that respond to mechanical pressure, or pressure receptors, that are embedded within joint capsules. Now, these tend to only be activated when our joints are placed in extreme angles. So if you think about it, for example, if you crouch down on your knees and you put a lot of weight on your knees and you get them, at their maximum bend, you can feel that pressure build up in your knees, right? And if you stand up and you stretch your leg out and you try to hyperextend your knee, of course, don't do that too much, you'll injure yourself. Again, you can feel that pressure at the extreme range of motions. But when your knee is bent at like a 90-degree angle, you probably don't really feel very much coming from the knee, right? And the same would be true of your elbow. You can try the same thing. So the joint capsules tend to respond with these mechanical pressures in the extremes of their range. But again, this is all part of a very complex picture of receptor activity coming from stretch receptors in the skin, muscles, tendons, and joints that all provide a very complex signal to the brain to inform about what the body is doing. Now, what kind of pattern is it that tells the brain what the body is doing? We've talked about this before with vision, where we want to talk about there are certain patterns of photoreceptor activity that provide information to the brain about what it is that we are seeing, right? So the same would potentially be true here. Not potentially, it must be true, that there would be a pattern of activity across these 4 types of receptors that informs the brain about position and orientation of the body, and then likewise the properties of any object that we come into contact with. The problem is that we just know so comparatively little about how this system works compared to how vision works, that we don't have a really good idea, and we don't have any, fancy theories. Like when we talked about visual object recognition, we had a variety of different theories about how the visual system puts together information to try to piece together parts of objects and recognize shape and size and stuff like that. And we really have very little like that for haptics, right? So big gap in our knowledge, really, when it comes to perception and psychology. So that's what I have raised right here, is the challenge here for the science of haptic perception, is answering this question: how does the receptor activity inform the brain about limb position and movement, and of course also objects that we come into contact with? I have here, a similar to what I've already said, a rough depiction of how these receptors respond to inputs. When the skin stretches, the Ruffini endings fire a little faster. When the muscles change their length, especially when they increase length, the muscle spindles fire faster. Golgi tendon organs fire with more increased tension in the tendon, and so on and so forth, right? So how do we combine the activity of these receptors to understand how the brain decodes that signal? Yep, no answers to that, not very good. But what we do know is that haptic perception and active touch work fairly well, right? Because if we look at some of this research where we have people try to recognize objects through touch alone, right? So you blindfold someone and you give them objects to recognize. They can, right? Especially if you give them familiar objects, right? If you give them everyday household objects, they're going to recognize them pretty well. And you can do this as a test, as an experiment, an informal little experiment. Blindfold someone and present somebody with everyday household objects and have them explore by hand using active touch. That is, you allow them to move their hands around and explore the object freely. They're going to recognize pretty quickly, I would think, what it is. But then conversely, you can try this using what we would say is passive touch, where you take the object, you just have the subject hold their hand flat like this, and then you take your object here. I'm going to use my little turtle sculpture I've used before, and you just press it. You turn it over and press it up against their skin in different ways, and they're going to feel the various pokes, but they're not going to recognize anything at all about the object, right? They're not going to be able to tell you what it is. So active touch is very good for recognition. Passive touch is not. This is what Gibson had done, except Gibson, instead of doing it with everyday household objects that we might be familiar with, he essentially machined this here, what is that, 10 different irregularly shaped novel objects, and each one is distinct, right? So even though they are all fairly similar looking, each one is distinct in terms of the different kind of protrusions that they all have. And he allowed people in the active touch condition, he allowed them to explore these objects by hand, right? So they're blindfolded, they just hold them by hand and they touch them and roll them around in their hands, and they get a sense for each object. And they gave them a fairly good long time, an hour, to kind of become familiar with these objects, right? And then after this learning phase, so each one gets a name, right? And after this learning phase, then you can place the objects in the people's hand, and when they are allowed to hold it and explore it with their hand, they can recognize which one it is. But if you try to just press it into their hand in a passive touch kind of situation, they can't recognize which one it is. You can also try what's called a same difference task, right? So a same different task is if you're just basically going to present two stimuli to the participant at two different times, and they have to judge whether those two stimuli are the same stimulus or a different stimulus. So I could take maybe item number one from the set here, and I can let a person explore it by active touch. And then I give them either the same object again, in which the correct answer should be to say same, or I give them one of the other objects, and their correct answer would be to say different. And so they would recognize that it's not the same object as before. So when active touch is allowed during this test, again, people are correct at this. But if we do it in a passive touch version where I just press the object into your hand, and then I take it away and I either press the same object into your hand again, maybe I flip it over, but I press it in again, or I pick a different object, what happens is people are not very good at on that same different task when it's passive touch, right? So again, it just reveals how important it is for us to move around and use the body to explore objects, to recognize them. Haptics is much more effective than just the passive tactile sensations when it comes to recognition. A few various other things that we happen to know that people are pretty good at when it comes to proprioception is here on the left is called a proprioceptive matching task. And this is, you see the two fingers that are coming together like this, right? But there's like a board in between them. So you can try this on a tabletop, right? If you put one hand under a table and you just kind of point your finger up to the other side of the table so you can't see it. But if you bring your other hand up, you find that it feels very intuitive that you can bring your two fingers into alignment, right? It's not very hard at all to do. So we can get our fingers matched up pretty well. In the other kind of matching task, now we're doing more of a whole limb segment. So the idea is that um, a person puts their two forearms or maybe their two legs into these kind of rotating palm board type situations. And an experimenter places one arm at a specific, that would be the reference arm. They place the reference arm at a specific position while the subject is blindfolded. And then the subject's job is to move the indicator arm to match the reference arm, right? And what we find is that people are really very good at matching these two joint angles. So again, something that we can do. We can perceive joint angle very well. And by the way, both of these kinds of tasks could rule out efference copy as a way of knowing where the hidden arm or hand is, because in many cases, it's the experimenter that passively places the hand on the underside of the table or the reference arm into its position. And therefore, it's not a descending motor control signal that put the hand in that position. And even though there's no motor signal for the brain to know where that arm is, we can still perceive where it is and align the indicator arm with it very correctly. Speaking of matching body positions, what about bringing the vision into this, right? Because we know that there's such a thing as hand-eye coordination. So are we good at coordinating eye position to hand position? We would think that we're pretty good at that, right? So here's a way to test it. You put someone in virtual reality. You see a picture here at the bottom of a person wearing the VR headset. The person is doing something with their hands, but obviously they can't see their hands. The head-mounted display is not transparent, so they can only see their virtual hands, which you see also projected on a screen here for us for convenience. And so the question is if I were to do an experiment where I were to take the virtual hands and draw them in a place in VR that does not perfectly align with where the real hands are, would our subject detect that discrepancy? And as it turns out, you can place the virtual hands as far as 5 centimeters away from where the real hands are before a subject would ever know that there's something up here, right? So there's some degree of ability to detect these discrepancies, but it's not super precise. So maybe what we might call visual proprioceptive matching or visual proprioceptive integration is it's not as great as we might otherwise expect it to be, right? All right, so that wraps up what we're going to talk about with haptics. And so I just want to run back here. So this is the first slide of the PowerPoints. I want to sum things up a little bit. And so what we have done is we've suggested that maybe if feed-forward control requires a lot of precise, exact information about where things are, especially where our hands are, that we may not have that very good of information, at least when it comes to evaluating where our hands are relative to other objects that we are not currently touching. So feed-forward control might face problems. Whereas it seems clear that we have fairly good haptic feedback from our bodies. And therefore, it might be that feedback control we would point to feedback control as sort of the alternative that might make a lot more sense in the majority of cases, that maybe we just have better evidence that when it comes to how we control our actions, the answer may be this closed loop feedback control. But there are problems potentially with feedback control as well. And I've mentioned this at the beginning of the whole set of notes here, which is that when we are moving very, very quickly, that doesn't give a lot of time to process the feedback, right? These feedback loops take a little bit of time to process information and evaluate error and then initiate corrections, right? So these are all stages of processing that would have to happen. And One thing that we could say is that maybe in certain situations, we don't have enough time for that. So maybe we have to use feed forward. So again, there's the possibility that maybe the answer is we use both. But what we're going to talk about in the next set of notes, which is our next major topic, we're going to move into the section of notes about affordances and dynamical systems theory. And these approaches are going to provide an alternative way of thinking about how we control our actions that might sidestep some of these fairly difficult challenges that these theories are faced with. So we are going to go ahead and stop it here.